Welcome to Human Monsters. Part 1. The Execution. June 16th, 1944, South Carolina. George Junius Stinney Jr. was 14 years old and on death row. 14-year-old boys had been candidates for execution in the past, but this had been the first occasion when it appeared that the execution would be carried out. He would go down in history as the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. Just shy of 3 months prior to that date, 2 little girls had been murdered in a village in Clarendon County. The girls were Caucasian, 11 years old, and 7 years of age. They were killed by blunt force trauma. Stinney was arrested soon after the girls were found, as he was suspected of having committed the murders. There was so much outrage in the community that, while they had seen no evidence that Stinney was responsible, they called for his blood, and he would surely have been lynched if he hadn't been put to death in a prison. In court, the case was rushed through. The jury deliberated for a grand total of 10 minutes before adjudging George guilty. There was a long-held belief among the white population at the time that black men were unable to control their sex drives and made a regular practice of raping white women, and George Stinney Jr. was the latest victim of that stereotype. The morning of the execution, George was transferred from what was called Tier F and brought to the building where the executions took place, a structure that was dubbed the Death House. It was a small brick building that housed 2 rooms. The execution chamber was a small space that contained the electric chair. The other room housed 6 cells with heavy bars. As frightened as George likely was, he wasn't alone in feeling that fear. Letters arrived from all over South Carolina at the governor's office in which the sender implored him to spare the boy's life. Such missives even arrived from other states. The governor was a member of the Pardon and Parole Board, but the letters did not elicit his sympathy. 3 days before the scheduled executions of Stinney and another inmate, the prison's captain of the guards, who was put in charge of supervising all preparations for the executions, entered the death house and obtained what he claimed was a so-called full confession from George Stinney, a portion of the transcript from the confession. "Which one did you kill first?" "The smaller girl. Then I hit the big one." "What did you hit them with?" "A piece of iron." 2 chaplains visited Stinney the night before his execution and found him to be lucid and calm. 7 a.m. The morning of the execution, the sheriff of Clarendon County paid a visit to Stinney's cell. He conducted an interview of his own, which he documented in the following form. "George, you know that you have only a few moments to live, don't you?" "Yes, sir." "Well, are you guilty of the crime for which you were convicted?" "Yes, sir." "Did any officer from the time that you were arrested up until now take advantage of you, threaten you, or punish you in any way?" "No, sir." "Was there anyone else with you when this crime was committed?" "No, sir." "Was there anyone else connected with or know anything about it?" "No, sir." "Well, goodbye, George." "Goodbye, Sheriff." 7:30 a.m. A procession dubbed the Execution Escort gathered in the cell, and Stinney and four guards walked to the adjacent chamber, where the electric chair was situated. George walked with the Bible tucked underneath his arm. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," kept conveniently under wraps. There was a public section of the execution chamber, and 50 witnesses were present. About 40 of them were native to Clarendon County, where the murders happened. Among them were the father of the girls. There were some female students from a criminology class facilitated by Allen University. James E. Gamble, the sheriff's son, was also in attendance. 39 years later, Gamble recalled how he felt as he witnessed the execution. "I wanted to get out of there bad." When George Stinney was brought into the chamber, he was asked if he wanted to say any last words. He said, simply, "No, sir." One of the chaplains said, "You don't want to say anything about what you did?" Stinney said, "No, sir." The chaplain whispered to someone else, "The way of the transgressor is hard." The guards led George to the electric chair, and he got situated. Fitting the related equipment proved to be more daunting than they anticipated. George was slight of build, so there was some difficulty in attaching an electrode to his right leg. Once that was resolved, the state electrician activated the current. 2,400 volts of electricity were sent coursing through George's body. The mask they put over his head was too large, and it fell off after the electricity began to flow. When the mask fell off, everybody could see that his eyes were open, and widely so. 2 more jolts of electricity were driven into him. 3 minutes and 45 seconds after the electrician sent the first currents through Stinney's body, a physician pronounced George dead. James Gamble remembered the execution vividly years later, and he recalled that it was not as clean as the officials might have hoped for. When they shot the juice to him, his head went up and the mask came off of his face, and I remember that saliva and all was coming out of his mouth, and tears from his eyes, and there was an odor that I really couldn't describe, but I hope I never smell such an odor again. Remembering the damage done to his body by the electric chair years later, one of George's sisters said, "I remember going to the funeral. I couldn't believe what they had done to that little boy. I'll never forget the way he looked." Being more specific, his other sister said that his body was scorched, seared, and burned. His skin was blue. Part 2, The Murders. Friday, March 24th, 1944, Alcolu, South Carolina. After getting home from school, Betty June Binnicker asked her 23-year-old sister, who was entrusted with her care while her mother was at work, for permission to go on a ride on her bicycle. She and her friend, neighbor Mary Emma Tams, made plans to pick flowers from alongside the local train tracks. Alcolu was a safe community where children were able to roam unsupervised because there was never a reason for the town's inhabitants to believe that some kind of threat to their well-being existed. They departed around 3 p.m., with Betty riding the bike and Mary standing on the handlebars. Alcolu was typical for a small town in the American South at the time, insomuch that it was racially segregated. George Stinney and his family lived in the black section of town near the railroad. When Betty and Mary pulled up, George and his younger sister, Amy, were tending to their cow's needs by letting her graze in a field. They were asked where the girls could find a particular kind of flower called a maypop. The Stinneys told them they grew along the railroad track. The girls continued their journey, and the Stinneys led their cow back home, where they gave her water. Local lore regarding the murders had it that George wandered away from his home after returning the cow to her quarters. His mother disputed this, insisting that she ran a tight ship, and George was not permitted to just wander about town, especially not when his chores were supposed to be done. 4:30 p.m. Betty June's mother returned from her job in nearby Sumter County, and she felt something wasn't right. It wasn't Betty's way to go off for an hour and not come back in at least a half hour. Mrs. Binnicker and her eldest daughter went looking for Betty, but could not find her anywhere. Before long, she began to worry and reported the disappearance to the sheriff's office in the township of Manning. Despite the racial divide in the town, all residents joined in the search for the two girls. George Sr. also participated. People joined in from as far afield as Sumter County, with members of the Lions Club and the Freemasons assisting with the effort. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., 16-year-old Francis Batson was searching for the two girls when he and the two men he accompanied spotted a small bicycle next to a ditch. The two girls, both having perished, were pinned underneath the bicycle. The bicycle was partially sabotaged. The front wheel had been removed, and some natural detritus was placed over top of it. The plant debris was not nearly enough to mask the horrors that had been visited upon the girls. Both their heads and faces had been bludgeoned. As a man named Lee Burke recalled years later, their brains were beat out. Their brains was a pulp. When the doctor examined their head and touched it there, they just bulged out. Feeling it was inappropriate to expose Francis to such a grisly visage, the men he assisted told him to go home. The sense of safety and trust among the residents of Alcolu disappeared overnight. The fact that such a heinous crime could happen in a town that had once offered a sanctuary for someone who wished to avoid the dangers of city living left the village's citizens disillusioned and paranoid for the years to come. An officer of the constabulary named Sidney J. Pratt was dispatched to Alcolu to spearhead an investigation. At one point, while walking the streets, he encountered an African American man and questioned him on what he knew about the murders. Pratt recalled how this conversation went. "This is very important as far as I'm concerned. I met a colored man. I'll not divulge his name. He was very concerned about it. I asked him if he knew of anybody that would do such a thing, and his reply to me was, 'The meanest fellow in this community is a boy by the name of George Stinney.'" Constable Pratt went to the Stinney house without a warrant and eavesdropped from the back porch as two male parties had a conversation. One of them said at one point, "Well, you will not tell on me." For Pratt, this was justification for bringing George Stinney in for questioning. As he recounted, "That was enough for me to hold him and question him, and for me to start a sure enough investigation." The officers entered the residence, still without warrants, and confronted George, who was talking with a cousin named John Green. The young men were both detained and brought into the Clarendon County jailhouse for questioning. John was unhelpful when pressed for information on what George meant when he said, "You will not tell on me." George steadfastly asserted his innocence at first. Pratt didn't buy it, and there was only one thing he wanted to hear: a full confession. He said to Stinney, "Well, apparently you're in deep trouble, and there's only one man that can help you. Do you know Mr. Alderman?" The Mr. Alderman in question was the proprietor of the local lumber mill, and he had leased housing and bestowed other benefits to his employees. He held a lot of power and was to be treated with respect. As Pratt recalled, up until that point, he was saying that he was innocent. When I got into the alderman situation, that Mr. Alderman might be of some aid to him, then he said he wanted to see Mr. Alderman. And before we got through questioning and talking with him, he admitted that he was guilty and that he had killed the two little girls. Stinney was asked what he used to kill the girls. He said it was a piece of pipe. At Stinney's trial, the murder weapon was identified as a railroad spike. The odds were stacked against George during the interrogation. At no point was he made aware that he was entitled to the representation of a lawyer. He was isolated. He was black while the two officers were white in the Jim Crow era. They also conveyed to him that he would have a soft place to land if only he confessed. When advised that Mr. Alderman might help him, he became more cooperative. He even accompanied the two officers to the ditch where the girls' bodies had been found. The ditch had become filled with water, but he fished out the length of pipe after swishing through it with his arm a couple of times. According to the officers, Stinney confessed to sexually abusing the girls. To quote Pratt, he also admitted that he had sexually assaulted. He didn't use that word, but had, quote, fooled with, end quote, one of the little girls after he hit them. I asked him some questions, enough to know that that was with her privates. George was transferred to a jail in Sumter County due to the threat of violence by lynch mobs. Up until this point, the black and white residents of Alcolu got along, even if they were segregated from each other. Now outright hostility boiled up. As one white resident recalled years later, "There was quite an upstir about it. When we found out that he went back and raped the girl twice, we were going to lynch him. He was going to die." Another man said, "Every, insert racial epithet, that was in the whole village that I'd come up on, I was ready to kill. They all got scared and stayed in their houses." Mr. Alderman advised George Sr. to gather his family together and leave town. As a member of one lynch mob recalled, "Of course he could have come back later on, I reckon, and have went back to work, but sentiments were so high, there was a lynching mob there ready to do it. The aldermans gave him all night to leave Alcolu. If he hadn't of, he wouldn't have got out. I reckon we would have got him." A physician examined the remains of the murdered girls. This is from his report. There were no bruises or discoloration about the genitalia, and the hymen was intact. This flies in the face of the allegations of sexual assault. Blunt force trauma left both girls' skulls broken and cracked. Hence, the anecdotal and scientific evidence were contradictory. There hadn't been a lynching in Alcolu since 1934, but it appeared that another one was imminent. As one person who participated in a discussion of the matter at the time pointed out, they said what they all wanted to do was to get him and hang him right there under that big pine tree. They were going to hang him under that pine tree. No white person questioned the possibility that George Stinney was guilty because of stereotypes regarding black males as being aggressive brutes, devoid of an ability to control their sexual appetites. Between 1880 and 1940, nearly 4,000 African Americans were lynched, so when the threat of a lynching arose, potential black victims took it seriously, and they lived in terror if they were announced as the target. 90% of them happened in the South. The victims of these hate crimes were hanged, shot, or burned. In some cases, they were dragged behind a moving vehicle. Though with many of the shootings the victim was dispatched with one shot and did not suffer, there were others that were shot hundreds of times, prolonging their agony. There were other tortures, like when victims were beaten to death with whips, clubs, or sticks. They could be stabbed with sharpened staves. They might be burned with blow torches. Mutilations were often carried out before death. The mutilations did not stop after death. Many members of the lynch mobs wanted souvenirs and would walk away with such items as fingers, toes, or ears, with occasional genitals and hunks of flesh. When a black gentleman accused of raping and murdering a white woman was tracked down by a lynch mob, he was tortured and killed before a crowd estimated to be comprised of up to 5,000 people. A reporter for the NAACP wrote this piece about the event. They cut off his penis. He was made to eat it. Then they cut off his testicles and made him eat them and say he liked it. Then they sliced his sides and stomach with knives, and every now and then somebody cut off fingers or toes. Red-hot irons were used on the insert racial epithet to burn him from top to bottom. From time to time, during the torture, a rope would be tied around Neil's neck, and he was pulled up over a limb and held there until he almost choked to death, when he would be let down and the torture began all over again. Neil's corpse was dragged by a car to the barn owned by the victim's family. A small crowd assembled to watch as some of them stuck him with knives. Others kicked his body. Cars drove over his remains while children stabbed it with sharpened staves. For weeks on end afterwards, some of them showed off the souvenirs they had taken, like his fingers and toes. George Stinney Jr.'s age would not negate the possibility of a lynching. Other boys his age had been lynched for similar allegations. Ray Baker, an investigative reporter at the time, described the ways in which lynch mobs behaved, often beyond the initial attack. With the thing it sets out to do, it is exactly like any other manifestation of uncontrolled human passion. Given license, it takes more license. It releases that which is ugly, violent, revengeful in the community. I have often heard of a, quote, quiet mob, an orderly mob, which went about its business and hanged the insert racial epithet, but in all the cases I have known about, and I have made special inquiries upon this particular point, not one single mob stopped when the immediate work was done, unless under compulsion. Even good citizens of Statesboro will tell you that the insert racial epithet, got only what they deserved. And it was all right if the mob had only stopped there, but it did not stop there. It never does. Though many lynchings were the product of a frenzy overtaking mobs of people, they didn't always emerge on impulse. Many were not only planned, but advertised as if it were a professional wrestling match. During the Victorian era, there was a significant class divide in the American South, with poor whites dismissed as crackers, hillbillies, and white trash. Their shared enthusiasm for lynchings brought them together somewhat. As journalist Arthur Roper noted, lynchings often serve as socializing forces within the white group. Not infrequently, more unanimity can be had on a lynching than on any other subject. Lynchings tend to minimize social and class distinctions between white plantation owners and white tenants, mill owners and textile workers, Methodists and Baptists, and so forth. This prejudice against the Negro forms a common meeting place for whites. While some state governors would intervene to stop lynch mobs from killing their targets, others would step aside and allow it. Not all white people were on board with lynching. As one op-ed piece went, it is alike injurious to the white people of the South who need the labor of the black population, and if the white people do not protect the helpless Negro, may we expect to have the Negro serve us upon the farms or in the city? If the white people of the South permit men to go unpunished and allow verdicts of coroners' juries to be procured to whitewash their bloody murders and to terrorize this humble race, how can we expect anything else than that railroads will be continually selling tickets to the colored people to go north? They feel like their very life depends on getting away. A man named Rustin Stooks was part of a mob that intended to lynch George Stinney Jr. if given the opportunity. As he put it, "We were going to lynch him. He was going to die. They made a deal with me. I was the head of it. Don't mind admitting it. They made a deal with us. Let them try him, and they'd guarantee us that we could see him if he was convicted. They didn't say he'd be convicted. We could see him if he got the electric chair." Following Stinney's sentencing, they got the permit or whatever they had to have to see it done. We went to Columbia to the penitentiary, and we went in there and we seen it happen. When asked decades later why Stinney was not hanged, Lee Burke, a man who drove to the proposed execution site with his gun on hand, commented on what happened. Was they so called to be a Christian? Well, whenever they got a hold of the boy, he said to me, "Lee, they're gone with him now to the jailhouse." So I said to him, "Well, I'm going," and I went back over to the jailhouse. Sheriff Eddie Gamble was standing there in this jail yard, and he walked back into the jail when I walked up, and he went in there and he told Newman, his deputy, he said, "Now, Lee Burke is standing out there, right there, in the jail yard, standing right there, and he's got a .38 pistol in his belt." And he says, "He ain't hiding it, and I don't know what's going to happen here." So the sled officer, Pratt, he comes out and got in his car and took off from around the back with a boy. Ben Alderman and the sheriff, Eddie Gamble and Huger Newman, and all come out there and says, "Lee, now that wasn't the boy. They really haven't got him. They're sending that one home right now." He recalled a conversation he had with Mr. Alderman. Ben started to crying. He said, "Lee," he says, "I've lied to you." And he says, "I hope you'll forgive me." He says, "That was the boy that Pratt took out of here, and I'm sorry that I lied to you, but I lied to you, and I hope you'll forgive me." And he says, "Pratt is carrying him to Columbia. He's confessed to everything." So I says, "Well, I reckon that's the right way for you to handle it, but you should have never done that, because it wouldn't have cost the state nothing. Everything would have been over in a short while." Burke also disclosed that had George Sr. not left Alcolu, he would have been lynched. Burke recalled the effect of the threat of violence had on the black population of Alcolu. "It just got to me, and I went to the house and got my damn rifle and started to cracking on them, see? And every one of them that would come upon to me and say, 'Mr. Lee, well, sir, you sure got him,' I'd hit him or kick him. And if he's have opened his mouth, I'd have killed him right there. Every insert racial epithet that was in the whole village that I'd come upon, I was ready to kill. They all got scared and stayed in their houses." This is from a testimony by Sheriff Newman. H.S. Newman, being sworn, says on Friday, March 24th, 1944, "I was called to Alcolu, South Carolina, near 10 o'clock and told that 2 little girls was missing, Betty June Binneker, other was Mary Emma Tams. When I got to Alcolu, there was a searching party searching for them, and near 8 o'clock Saturday morning, I was notified that the bodies had been found. I went down to where the bodies were at. I found Mary Emma Tams. She was right at the edge of the ditch with 4 or 5 wounds on her head. On the other side of the ditch, the Binneker girl were lying there with 4 or 5 wounds in her head. The bicycle which the little girls had were side of the little Binneker girl. On information I received, I arrested a boy by the name of George Stinney. He then made a confession and told me where a piece of iron about 15 inches long were. He said he put it in a ditch about 6 feet from the bicycle wheel, which was lying in the ditch. The piece of iron were found in water where he said it were at." The grand jury issued what were called true bills, which indicted George Stinney in advance of his trial. George Stinney was at a marked disadvantage when it came to his trial. For one thing, he had already confessed. Also, he had a history of violence. He once pushed a 16-year-old white boy off his bicycle. He had also harassed and harmed black children. There was little his parents were able to do to curb his aggressive behavior toward others. The day before the murder, he injured a schoolmate with a pair of scissors. An important aspect of the evidence that was only taken into consideration decades later was the fact that there was no blood on George's clothing after the murders. Fracturing the skulls of 2 children would surely result in a great deal of blood loss. April 21st, the trial of George Stinney Jr. began. A curious fact about the gallery was many white women attended the trial. There was no Jim Crow section in the courtroom, so many African Americans sat among the whites. In keeping with tradition, the judge said to Stinney, "How will you be tried?" George said, "By God and my country." Many letters and telegrams were sent to Governor Olin Johnston, pleading with him to give Stinney clemency or at least commute his sentence to life instead of execution. The governor's public response was, "Pratt tells me that Stinney confessed to killing the younger of the girls near Alcolu to get her out of the way so that he could rape the older girl. Stinney then told officers that he killed the older girls with a railway spike and that he dragged her out of a swamp to rape her. Further, he said that he went back about 20 minutes later to the girl and that she was so cold he desisted from his intention to rape her again. The jury's deliberations took less than 10 minutes. George Stinney Jr. was designated guilty as charged, and they recommended the death penalty. In the courtroom, the judge addressed Stinney directly in keeping with tradition when it came to doling out a death sentence. It being solemnly demanded of the prison at the bar, if he hath anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon him, and he having answered nothing further unless he had before said, wherefore it is considered by the court and pronounced as the judgment of the law, that you, the said George Stinney Jr., be taken thence to the place whence last you came, there to be kept in close and safe custody until you shall be removed in accordance with the law to the state penitentiary in Columbia, South Carolina, at which place on Friday the 16th day of June, A.D. 1944, between the hours of 6 o'clock a.m. and 6 o'clock p.m. Though George had been composed throughout most of the trial, a news reporter wrote about the reaction to receiving the death penalty. Only when asked to rise and receive the sentence did he appear nervous and slightly excited. He bit his nail and twisted his fingers while facing the judge, but soon regained his composure. He was escorted back to the county jail soon after the trial was adjourned. Eventually, he was transferred to Columbia State Prison to be housed in protective custody, since lynch mobs were still more than eager to carry out their own execution. Governor Olin Johnston received 1,500 letters, telegrams, and petitions imploring him to spare George Stinney's life and commute his sentence to life. The NAACP failed to act on Stinney's behalf, despite having done so with many trials where African Americans were being tried unfairly or with inadequate representation. It wasn't exactly the most racially harmonious time in American history for a young black man to sidestep the death penalty. When South Carolina Governor Olin Johnston heard that excluding black people from voting rights was ruled unconstitutional in Texas, he said, "We South Carolinians will use the necessary methods to retain white supremacy in our primaries and to safeguard the houses and happiness of our people. The representatives of these agitators, scallywags, and unscrupulous politicians that called themselves white men and used the colored race to further their own courses back during Reconstruction and in our midst today, and history will repeat itself unless we protect ourselves against this new crop of carpetbaggers and scallywags who would use the colored race to further their own economic and political gains. Now's the time to act. White supremacy will be maintained in our primaries. Let the chips fall where they may." November 3rd, 2013. A headline in the South Carolina newspaper, the Sumter Item, read, "Lawyers seek retrial of executed teen." It had been 69 years since George Stinney Jr. had been put to death in the electric chair. Stinney's case had never been entirely forgotten by those who were around to hear the story. Authors, documentary filmmakers, and journalists still hadn't forgotten it. In 1985, attorney David I. Bruck cited the case as part of an article he published in which he stated his argument against the use of the death penalty against underage offenders. Many works of fiction were inspired by the case, such as Stephen King's The Green Mile. In 2006, an African American man named George Frierson decided to look more closely at the case. He was a member of the school board in Clarendon County. He would read every article he could get his hands on regarding the case. He was going about it alone, and as he put it, at times it has been a bit lonely, my work on this case. At times I have been worried about my safety. But I'm convinced that this young man is innocent, and I can't just sit back and let history record him as guilty. Fortunately, Frierson would not prove to be the only person who took an interest in this case. In 2009, attorney Steve McKenzie had done research on the execution in his own right. In 2013, McKenzie discussed the topic of courtroom injustice with a junior member of his firm named Matt Burgess. After researching the case more in depth, Burgess concluded that there had been a miscarriage of justice. Burgess approached George's surviving siblings, who were in their golden years by then. They were reluctant to get involved in the case, having made peace with it so long ago. Nevertheless, Burgess was persistent and persuasive, and they consented to a draft for a new trial, which was submitted in December 2013. After decades of inertia, the case suddenly attracted widespread attention due to extensive media coverage. Civil rights leaders took an interest in the case. A candlelight vigil was held out in front of the Clarendon County Courthouse. January 21st, 2014. The first day of the hearing. The judge felt that the issue was not a racial one, but whether Stinney got a fair trial. However, she did say, "No one herein can justify a 14-year-old child being charged, tried, and executed in 83 days." The prosecutor was the male descendant of South Carolina's first African-American Supreme Court justice. He said, "Back in 1944, we should have known better, but we didn't. The fact of the matter is, it happened, and it occurred because of a legal system that was in place." He went on to characterize it as appalling. George's siblings didn't end up providing much in the way of exonerative material. Their accounts of what happened involving George on the day the two girls were murdered were at times vague and contradictory. A former cellmate of George Stinney's, named Wilford Johnny Hunter, testified about a conversation he had with George before he was executed. He said that when he asked George why he was in jail, he was told that he was accused of killing two white girls and, quote, they were going to electrocute him, and that he didn't kill the girls and that they made him say those things. Dr. Amanda Salas, a forensic psychiatrist, wrote about this case and said that it would have been easy to intimidate George Stinney into confessing to the crimes because of his young age and the absence of adults representing him, especially an attorney. A challenge to Burgess was that a transcript of the original trial had not been made, and George's siblings and other relatives were not permitted to attend the original trial. A writ of coram nobis was submitted. Coram nobis is a legal order allowing a court to correct its original judgment upon discovery of a fundamental error that did not appear in the records of the original judgment's proceedings and that would have prevented the judgment from being pronounced. After all, many questions needed to be answered. Why was there no lawyer present when George gave his confession? Why had George's public defenders failed to point out the inconsistencies in the autopsy reports? Why didn't his attorneys cross-examine the prosecutor's witnesses? Why hadn't they asked for a change of venue since the jury was comprised of nothing but white men in a county with a large African American population and with a threat of lynching in the air? Why was the trial concluded within a single afternoon? It took almost a year for the judge to rule on the case. The Stinney family wasn't optimistic. They assumed that South Carolina would sweep the case under the rug as it had before. December 17th, 2014. In the judge's ruling, she wrote, "This court finds fundamental constitutional violations of due process exist in the 1944 prosecution of George Stinney Jr. and hereby vacates the judgment." Backing this up, she cited the following criteria: failure to provide effective assistance of counsel at all critical stages in a criminal prosecution, failure by counsel to request a change of venue despite pretrial publicity and juror prejudice, failure of the defense counsel to cross-examine witnesses or file an appeal, improper jury composition. She also wrote, a violation of the defendant's procedural due process rights tainted his prosecution. She wrote that the court was granting relief in the form of a coram nobis, quote, not on the grounds that the judgment against him was wrong on the merits, but that the courts have failed in a capital case to discharge their proper functions with due regard to the constitutional safeguards in the administration of justice. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.